Welcome to Heart of a Shepherd. This is the first of two devotions for today. And by the way, this is the close of our study of the Old Testament and the Book of Malachi. So this is the first two devotionals. The title of this one is "The End is Merely the Beginning." Again, this is part one. Well, our study of the Old Testament scriptures does conclude with a summary of chapters 2, 3, and 4 of the Book of Malachi. And I am so happy that you have followed me through our journey through the Old Testament. It began almost 19 months ago. Well, let's consider Malachi chapter 2 for the first of two video devotionals. Now, if you'll notice with me, Malachi chapter 2 and verses 1 through 9, here we have the priest, or that would be the ministers, failed the people. Now, Malachi's focus on unfaithful priests began in chapter 1, continued in chapter 2. Now, those spiritual leaders were guilty. They were guilty of accepting and sacrificing inferior offerings, though they knew they were violating God's law. Now, the prophet confronted the priest and he accused them of despising the privilege of the priesthood. And so he warned the priests that the Lord would curse them for not serving from the heart. In fact, he says in verse 2, "Ye do not lay it to heart." In other words, you're hypocrites. In a graphic portrayal then of God's disdain for the hypocrisy, the Lord warned, and I quote, "I will corrupt your seed." Could be either your grain or even your children. "I will corrupt your seed and spread dung upon your faces, even the dung of your solemn feast, and one shall take you away with it." Well, the Levites' duty was to live righteous lives and to teach the people how to live as unto the Lord, and that would be as according to his law. And yet many priests led the people astray, causing them to stumble in verse 8. Now, they corrupted the law, and God warned in verse 9 that he would cause the people to despise them, despise the priests, the ministers. And then verses 11 through 16, we have the men of Judah corrupted the institution of marriage. Now, particular condemnation was directed to the men of the tribe of Judah who were guilty of divorcing their wives and taking heathen, idolatrous wives in verse 11. Well, Malachi warned that those men, the men of Judah, would be cut off. Now, the Lord would reject their sacrifices, verses 12 through 13, though they came to the altar with tears. And Malachi then warned that the Lord regardeth not the offering of any more, or receiveth it with good will at your hand. We really get an idea of God's opinion about hypocrisy. Now, those hypocrites, however, dared to ask in verse 14, why? Why does the Lord reject our sacrifices? Well, Malachi spared no words in condemning them for violating the sanctity of marriage in verse 15. Rather than rejoice in the wife of their youth, and follow God's design for husband and wife to be one, that is, to be one flesh, the men of Judah divorced their wives. Tragically, I would suggest to you that believers of our day have followed the same pattern as we see committed by the men of Judah, whom the Lord condemned. In fact, in today's church, divorce has sadly become commonplace. Well, Malachi boldly declared God's heart on the matter of divorce, and he said in verse 16, "For the Lord, the God of Israel, hateth putting away," that is, divorce. Why? Because divorce is as violent to the spirit as tearing a garment. Notice that illustration in verse 16. So divorcing one's wife, then, is an act of treachery against God and one's spouse. And then notice in verse 17 how the people question God's justice. Now, chapter 2 then concluded with a simple attitude that is familiar today, I would suggest. In Malachi's day, the wicked challenged God's justice, and they said in verse 17, "Everyone that doeth evil is good in the sight of the Lord, and he delighteth in them," or, "Where is the God of judgment?" In other words, they were asserting that God is not just. Well, here's a warning for you. Call evil good, if you will, but there will be a day of justice, and the Lord will judge and bring the sins of darkness to light. Now, this is the conclusion of the first of 2 devotionals for today. I encourage you, follow it up with me as we consider Malachi chapter 3 and chapter 4 in the next video devotional. God bless you. Thank you for being a part of Heart of a Shepherd, and bye-bye.